Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us again here today. Our next session is a live edition of the Light Beer Dark Money podcast, hosted by Chris Clemens and Sean Noble. Chris Clemens is the former vice chairman and CEO of Golden Eagle Distributors. For nearly 75 years, Golden Eagle served as a family-owned, Arizona-based wholesaler for several major national brewers. Chris is the founder of the Rise Up Foundation, a conservative public policy educational foundation which partners with leading conservative nonprofits to promote and train the next generation of conservatives in Arizona. Chris is also the creator, co-host, and producer of the Light Beer Dark Money podcast, which highlights leaders in areas of faith, freedom, and free enterprise. Sean Noble has been active in campaigns and public policy for nearly 30 years. He started his political career running Congressman John Shadeg's first campaign and spent 10 years as chief of staff to the Arizona Republican. He became the go-to campaign advisor for conservatives and conservative issues, has managed campaigns for Congress, U.S. Senate, governor, state legislatures, and ballot initiatives. As a result of his transformational work in independent expenditures in politics, he has earned the moniker of the Prince of Dark Money and Dark Money Man. Sean is president of DC London, Inc., and is a partner with both Compass Strategies Public Affairs and A2P. He is the other co-host of the Light Beer Dark Money podcast. Take it away.
All right. Well, welcome to another episode of Light Beer Dark Money. I'm Sean Noble.
And I'm Chris Clements.
And we are live today. If you're listening, then you'll know that you'll hear an echo because we're in a big ballroom at ASU. And we are doing a very special live event with ASU to talk about some important economic issues. Free enterprise, one of the parts of our
and economic freedom, which is probably, it's why we started the podcast.
Yes. Yeah.
Talk about the three founding principles of our fair country: faith, freedom, free enterprise. And ASU has been a leader in these areas for quite some time. And we're just happy to be here. We're happy that they're hosting us, and happy to be on stage with some folks who are going to teach us about a little bit about free enterprise system.
Some very smart people.
Yes.
So let's start with Steve.
And us too.
Yeah.
Right.
Steve, give us a little bit about yourself.
So my name is Steve Slavinsky. So I'm Deputy Director of Research at the Pacific Legal Foundation, but in a prior life, I was Senior Research Fellow here at the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty at ASU. I'd been with the center from 2014. It was before Ross even got here. And I get to do a lot of research on even now, just as before at ASU. I basically look at how government regulations hurt entrepreneurs, how it hurts workers, how regulations can have unintended consequences. And so I get to do this for fun. I don't tell my employers. I would do it for my free time too. But for the most part, it's a wonderful job, and I get to occasionally talk to legislators and policymakers and help it change policy. And so the important part is knowing where the right answers are, knowing how to achieve the right reforms. And so that's the kind of thing that I like to do. And I know Ross likes to do that kind of thing. And that's one of the reasons that the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty was put together at ASU in the first place.
Right. Ross, tell us about yourself.
I'm Ross Emmett, a professor of economic thought at the School for Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. This really long name, so let me repeat it. School for Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership.
Nothing about using economy of words on that, right?
No, this is SCETL.
And then the acronym, unfortunately, is SCETL. So I feel like I scuttle about.
Is it referred to as the SCETL?
Yeah, no, fortunately, no. And in that context, as a professor, I teach a course in the history of economic thought, in which economic freedom plays a prominent role, and then I direct the center. And among the center's activities is the Doing Business North America project. I can say in part that I brought the project with me to Arizona State. At my previous institution, we had played around with some of the ideas that are part of this report. We had some money from a foundation to look at one category of the report and have students look to see just the starting a business category. And so when I came here and I realized sort of how we were positioned between the business school and the School for Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, and the opportunities that presented for us, I thought, well, why don't we try to see if we can do something unique with this famous report that had existed. You heard about it in an earlier session if you were here in the audience. The report was called the Doing Business Report, which was done by the World Bank for a long time and is no longer being done. And so it was like, well, could we revive some version of that? And we decided to do this city level study and focus on North America. So we can get into more about that.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna dive deep into that. But first, for those listening, we're recording on Thursday, December 1st.
Yeah.
No, it's Friday.
Friday.
It's Friday, December 1st. And just this morning, we had the sad news that Sandra Day O'Connor passed away.
Yeah.
That's relevant here at ASU because this law school is named after her. It's obviously relevant to us here in Arizona because she was quintessentially Arizonan. As most people who are listening would know, she was appointed to the Supreme Court by Ronald Reagan, and just an institution. I mean, amazing.
Well, I got to meet her a couple years ago. I do a program with the Young Presidents Organization called Inside Washington, and we bring CEOs from all over the world to Washington, D.C., about 35 CEOs to wander around Washington and teach them about how the inner workings of Washington are. We go to the White House. We have dinner up at the Capitol. Congressman David Schweikert does a nighttime tour of the Capitol, which is always fun. But one of the highlights of our conference several years ago was going to the chambers of the Supreme Court. And a lot of people don't know that even if you retire as a justice in the Supreme Court, you still have an office there. And so she had an office there. She was keeping an office there. She was good enough to meet with us. And my family has a long-standing history here in Arizona. We were a ranching family back in the early days of the state. My grandfather was a businessman here, owned a company called All American Distributing, and he knew Justice O'Connor pretty well. My dad knew her very well. And so we had a nice exchange about that there along with everyone else. And her big passion later after she retired from the Supreme Court was civics. And she, along with our former governor, Doug Ducey, his first act as governor was to sign legislation requiring students in the state of Arizona to be able to pass a basic civics exam.
Right.
And that was her doing. That was her lobbying of him. And now she took that across the country, and many other governors have done the same. So that's part of her legacy here in Arizona that complemented our friend Doug Ducey's legacy.
Yeah. Well, we definitely say she's probably one of the most important women in American history.
Oh, completely.
And she certainly personified the strong, independent woman.
Oh, yeah.
So,
for sure.
There's also, if I may, there's an economic liberty link here too.
Yes.
If you remember the Kelo decision. So this was the eminent domain case, right?
Yeah.
So the city of New London took away a woman's house to basically build something that isn't actually there at all anymore. And it was never there in the first place. It was a severe violation of property rights, right? It went to the Supreme Court, and Justice O'Connor was in the minority on that. But the opinion that she penned is beautiful. It's inspiring. It's such an amazing, robust defense, philosophically and just personally, of property rights that I know it inspired lots of individual people that I know personally to go into property rights litigation, to defend property owners.
Right.
It's inspired constitutional amendments at the state level to protect property homeowners in particular. So that's the kind of thing that I think it's so amazing to see someone who can get into public office, or rather into public service really, and just have such a tremendous impact, even if she's on the losing side. I think that's the kind of thing that's astounding, I think, about her.
And that goes to the power of her intellect and her persuasion, that even when she was on the losing side of a vote within the court, what she wrote about it had lasting impact. without question. So, and there's many places you could point to, but that's a great one to point out. Very relevant.
It's one of my
for us.
favorites.
Yep. So let's dive into the Doing Business North America study. Well, for those of us here in Arizona, what I found interesting was that Chandler, Arizona, is the top-ranked Arizona city at number 24.
Yeah.
Now, this proves that ASU doesn't have bias towards its hometown.
At least we don't.
Because number one, and I would encourage people to go. We'll put this a link to this report on our website, but to go to this and take a look. But Salt Lake City is number one.
Yeah. Well, followed by Boise at number 2.
Boise, Idaho.
Yeah, and you mentioned Chandler, but what was really striking to me, as someone who grew up in the old Pueblo, that Tucson outranked Phoenix
By one.
by 1.
But Tucson was
How does
48,
that work?
Phoenix, I don't know. I mean, maybe these guys can explain it. But the good news, and
Somebody needs to tell Tucson that.
Tucson's going to get a big head. The thing that I thought was very interesting and obvious was at the very bottom of the list are all the California cities.
Yeah, well.
No surprise there, Mr. Newsom.
Yeah, that who we have? Well, we have Fresno, Los Angeles, San Jose,
Los
San
Angeles
Francisco,
barely
which I would
eked
imagine
out
San Francisco is
over
much.
San Juan, Puerto Rico.
Yeah, I would imagine San Francisco is much lower now if you were to in 2023.
Not after the cleanup that Gavin Newsom did.
Well, that is true.
Well,
Yeah.
Steve and Ross.
Apparently,
you guys-
there's a map. I did not know there was a map of San Francisco where everything had to be cleaned up.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, that was mentioned in the debate last night.
And then they didn't clean up the
And
other
no, they
part.
cleaned it up, and I'm sure it's going to go back the way
Yeah.
it was.
California definitely all the cities rank towards the bottom. So it's not just an individual city level
Yeah.
issue, it's also a state level issue. Yeah.
Which is no surprise, given the regulatory environment and other things.
Well, and then also, what was 1 million people have left California?
Yeah.
Over 750,000 people moved to Florida. We've gained a couple 100,000 here in
Texas is
in Arizona and in Texas. It's actually a really sad state of affairs from an economic standpoint, and it's not sustainable. They've got about $20 billion of debt, and Florida has a huge surplus. We've been operating on a smaller surplus, and it creates we're seeing, because of economic policy, and I'd like to get into this discussion, but the tribalism of the states is becoming, especially after COVID, is becoming much more acute. The policies that these states are pursuing. I was really surprised, in that vein, that the score of starting a business, number 1 was Minneapolis, Minnesota, given its history over the last 3 years.
Yeah. No, it's interesting, and I'm sure Ross can speak to this as well. One thing that we noticed, and part of the reason that Ross started to kind of generate ideas on this project, and we were spitballing some ideas back when I was here at ASU, and the idea was that so many of these economic freedom or economic liberty indices are state level. But of course, there's a lot of variation within state. Yes,
Right.
it seems monolithically bad that all California cities are toward the bottom, right? But look at Texas, even Arizona, right? There's variation between the cities.
Right.
And that's because you got the state that will just kind of create sort of a foundation of specific laws and rules, tax laws, regulations, things like that. But then cities will often go above and beyond. Now, Arizona is a little unique because we actually have barriers on what the cities can do. I actually think that's a good thing.
Right.
But other states don't have that. And so you will see a state like Texas will have varying degrees of economic freedom, higher degrees in places like Dallas than might be in Austin, for instance. And so looking at the city level was actually crucially important because that's where people live.
Right.
You say you live in a state, but you also live in a city. In fact, fundamentally, you're more often living in a city. And a lot of those regulations are going to impact you, sometimes even more heavily than the state ones.
So Ross, give us some general guidelines or what are the guardrails as to why is Salt Lake number 1, Boise number 2, Chandler 24, and then you got Phoenix at 49 and LA at the very bottom.
Well, let me just
82.
start by pointing out that there's 6 different categories that are measured. And so for each category, a city gets a different score. And then you put those together and you have the total score. And so that means that the path towards both how the ranking works, but also towards what you're interested in as well is, if I was a legislator or a state legislator or a city official, what would I be looking at to see if I could become more competitive with other cities? There's a whole variety of possibilities because every city score is constructed in different ways. Even though Phoenix and Tucson are in the same state, they have different scores because it's not just the state, it's also the city
Right.
level decision. And which of these categories are more at the state level and which categories are more at the city level? So for example, starting a business tends to be a state level decision, whereas issues around land and space use and some of the electricity issues can be affected by city level activity. So the variation comes from the fact that there are different places you can focus on, and there's different things that people will focus on in different areas. And some of it is just a common number. In fact, the resolving insolvency category is the same for every city in the United States. Because bankruptcy law is a federal jurisdiction. So we all have, no matter what state we are from, we all have the same process for resolving insolvency. So it's in the report. We didn't take it out of the report, partly because the World Bank's report has the whole process from birth of a city, birth of a company, to death of a company.
Got it. Okay.
It's the life cycle of the business.
So you kept it consistent with the original World Bank process.
idea.
Right. Okay.
First category, starting a business. What are you going to do next? Okay, you might rent office space, but you're also going to hire an employee.
Right.
So you're going to hire an employee. You're going to get electricity. You're going to have land and space use. You're going to be paying taxes, and you're going to end up taking yourself out of business. Right. So that's the structure of the report, and very small differences especially in this report. Very small differences matter a lot. So it's hard. I mean, the whole report is built on this, but the differences. I'm just looking at two cities side by side, Indianapolis, Indiana, and Austin, Texas, which are 32nd and 33rd on the ranking. The distance between them is what?
A tenth of a point or something, yeah.
0.02, 0.12,
hundredths of a point.
0.12, yeah. So it's a very small difference in the measurement, but we follow the measurement to get the ranking.
Right.
Because what matters, as all of us know, what matters is where you're ranked.
Right.
So and that helps. That's how the report's built.
Yeah, and it's a relative ranking too, and that's important because cities are competing with each other for workers and for investment capital and things like that, right? We've seen that. People leaving California going to different places. Just because they land in Texas doesn't mean they're going to land necessarily in Austin. They'll land in Dallas. They'll go to different places. And so I think it's important to also realize that sometimes when cities do worse, it's not because they changed things per se, just cities they were competing with did better, right? But that's also an incentive and a spur, I think, to policymakers to make sure that when they're in competition internationally, frankly, for workers and capital and ideas and people, that they understand that their relative rank is going to be important, even if it is only very small degrees of difference.
Yeah. Well, and it kind of, when you look at a place like San Francisco I have to look where Portland falls on here. Oh, pretty low, 69. Okay.
There you go.
You almost get the sense that there are some cities, Portland in particular, because they had the urban growth ring. They've done a lot of public policy to stifle growth. And so it's no wonder they're having challenges, right?
Absolutely. In fact,
That actually
again,
has a real world impact.
well, there's a very consistent pattern in the empirical literature on this, is when you have more restrictive economic policies, you have less job growth, you have less job creation, and less personal income growth. And so over time, you can't sustain that long term. So in some respects, I've always argued that California is sort of a weird case because they've been able to limp along in spite of all the self-inflicted wounds, right? And that's probably because there's a lot of natural advantages to being on a coast, for instance, or just the actual favorable climate in certain parts, right? So some things are unchangeable, but the things that policymakers can control, that's the kind of thing we're trying to measure with DBNA, is just the idea that there are policies you can do that can actually augment those natural advantages, not. So in a sense, it's squandered potential in California, right? So that's the kind of thing we want to highlight with this report.
Well, I mean, imagine the policies of California in Ohio.
Right.
That place would be a ghost town.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing, well, no offense to Ohio, there's nothing really to draw you to Ohio, right? Whereas California is beautiful. The weather's beautiful, it's beautiful, it's got the ocean, all those things. Ohio, maybe India. No, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to offend all our listeners in the Midwest. Sorry, guys.
You're digging
the hole.
hole there, yeah. Although,
But going back to
Columbus ranked pretty high, so there you go.
But even going back to the real world example, the real Arizona example, the differences between Tucson and Phoenix. I mean, Phoenix is seen as this pro-growth, pro-business, very business-friendly environment. Tucson is not, and yet it ranks just a little bit higher. In fact, Tucson hasn't really grown very much in the last 10 years at all. Its business community is rather fragmented. I would argue that Phoenix, the business community really makes things happen in Phoenix. In Tucson, it's a very liberal town. It's more of a machine, kind of that machine runs the town. And so it ranking higher is really interesting.
There's some interesting anomalies. I shouldn't call them anomalies.
Just a tad,
They're different. So and that, I think that's largely due to the construction of how things are measured, right? Because you have to make decisions about how you're going to measure things and how you're going to make these relative comparisons. Some cities, Charlotte, North Carolina is a good example. In years past, they scored fairly high. And it wasn't because they were necessarily better at tax policy, for instance. It's just that they had actually really good zoning laws. They actually didn't mind if you had more what they call infill development and things like that, right? And so as a result of having 6 categories, and we didn't want to weight them differentially, right? That was important. We wanted to be very consistent and transparent. Say, okay, all categories work the same. And so some cities might have a couple categories they do really well in, do very poorly in the others, you average it out. They're in the middle of the pack. It doesn't mean they're necessarily great on everything, right? Minimum wage is a good example. Minimum wage is in the employment workers category. There's actually wide variation, even within Arizona, on that, right? Because we adjust it for cost of living, but we also have city level ordinances that might escalate the minimum wage faster than the cost of living or faster than the state minimum wage. And so those types of differences are going to be reflected in individual categories. And so if we broke it out, which is part of the reason why we like to show individual category rankings, that might explain some of the what seems like a weird result actually looks like, okay, they're better on one thing, but not on another. And of course, if you're a business and you're looking to relocate, there are some things that are going to matter more to you, right? Large scale manufacturers are going to have a much different kind of risk profile or regulatory ability to bear the cost of certain regulations than other maybe lower margin, mom and pop, restaurants or something.
Yeah. And I also would like to point out here, and Steve gets some of the credit for this, and Mason has the staff member for the center who has been charged with keeping the DBNA project going and building it stronger, has also pointed this out. We've tried to choose cities in each state that have so we get a cluster of cities and not just one. So for Arizona, it's obvious with the cities around Phoenix. Several of them are also part of the report. But in other states, you might have 2 cities that are the dominant cities in the state. Pennsylvania, right? I mean, Pittsburgh is practically in another country to Philadelphia.
Right. Yeah.
So you want that, but you also then, the idea as you build this report is to capture some of these clusters of cities so that we can actually see Chandler versus Phoenix versus Glendale, see those differences. And of course, we did it here in Arizona first because we wanted to get that kind of clustering effect. And that may provide researchers and companies in the future with insights as to why, what policies were the ones that made those differences, that kind of thing.
Yeah, interesting. One of the things I was thinking about when I was thinking about Phoenix, we've had a bit of the last few years, decade or so. There's been, it feels like the downtown area of Phoenix has had a resurgence. Mm-hmm. And as I thought about it, I really have to give ASU most of the credit because there's been so much growth of the footprint of ASU, creating some actual activity in downtown, which has typically been, years ago was just dead. That obviously isn't necessarily studied as a part of that, but I think it's interesting to note, since we're at ASU, that ASU's had a pretty good impact.
Yeah, it's not pandering at all. No, I think this shows you the benefit of city centers. So the idea of what they call agglomeration economies, the idea that you're attracting people. In the knowledge economy, this becomes even more important and salient. If you have a city that is desirable to live in, and costs are an issue in that case, right? It's part of the reason why, even though you have a place like San Jose and San Francisco, where, the seed of Silicon Valley, basically, and yet they're losing companies because of the costs, not just of doing business, but also of living there, right? And all that's a direct result of government policies on zoning that makes it impossible to build a house, or if you do so, it's going to have a ridiculous amount of mandates on it that is going to price most people out of the market, right? Those types of things matter, and so it's not just an institution-based analysis or emphasis. It's also just the idea that you need workers. That's why we have an employing workers category here. You need workers to work these businesses as well. And in a case like Phoenix, I think we've been lucky in Arizona. I mean, partly, yes, we're next to California, so it's low-hanging fruit, if you will. Right. But we're not necessarily the obvious choice for a lot of businesses. Nevada, just north of us, has no income tax, right? Texas doesn't either. Right. But New Mexico, doesn't look so great either, right? So we're kind of sandwiched between two. I'd call California a basket case. New Mexico is a work in progress. But the point being, if you have the kind of bed of fundamental desirability, and that's a lot of different attributes that are rolled into it, those agglomeration economies can become very beneficial for the residents. Yeah.
I'd like to add in one additional element here, and it gives me a chance to give a shout out to a member of the audience as well. One of the first researchers who used the Doing Business report is here. Alicia Plemons is over here in the middle of the audience. And Alicia, one of the first studies she did using the Doing Business report was a study about movement of people from California to Arizona. But instead of focusing on whether the question, which I assumed she was going to address, which is, are people moving to Arizona to start a business? What she did was look at labor movements of the population, including people who are looking for work. And she found that people were moving from California to Phoenix, that it was statistically significant difference in the ranking of for example, between California cities in Las Vegas and Phoenix, right? I think that's right. So that Phoenix did pretty well in that sense of attracting people from California towards Phoenix in order to find work, not to start a company. Right?
Okay, so it's a worker and employment.
So it's a good place to go to find employment. And it's those kinds of uses of a report like this that I think can assist people. You're capturing ideas and potentially even being able to sort of encourage people. Like, have you thought about the fact that because there's a a freedom in starting a business in a particular location over another location, that people might want to go there because there are no businesses are looking for new employees.
Yeah.
Now, we don't pick that up directly, but we can infer it from other work.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to go back to Ohio for a second.
Okay.
Because you pointed out that, different places. So you have Columbus and Cincinnati both in the top 20, and then Cleveland way down at mid-50s.
Yeah.
Right. No surprise there. Cleveland's got the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, so it's got something. But I will say that the anecdote on Cleveland is I was flying into Milwaukee, Wisconsin a few years ago. And I look out the window of the plane as I'm descending into Milwaukee, and I see on the roof below me, it says, "Welcome to Cleveland." And a guy had decided as a prank for all the air traffic going over him that he was going to make people think, "Oh my gosh, I'm in the wrong place."
Wow.
And I think it was he was just punking Cleveland because, nobody wants to be in Cleveland. You're flying into Milwaukee. It's like, I don't want to be in Cleveland. So, apparently it's better to be Cincinnati or Columbus if you're in Ohio. So,
Well, this was brought up in one of the earlier panels, but Philadelphia is ranked pretty high there too, which was complete shock.
No, it is. Yeah, it is interesting because there's specific things. There's a good example.
And going back to your list, I'm like,
Yeah.
where would they be on?
Yeah. This is a good example because
a business
of all of the categories. Philadelphia actually usually, if I remember correctly, at least earlier on, it ranked fairly poorly because they have a very weird tax structure. They've got city level taxes that most cities don't have. Even New York has different doesn't have the kind of tax that Philadelphia has. It's a specific, I forget exactly what it was. It's kind of what they call a gross receipts tax. It's basically, you pay it even if you don't make a profit is effectively what happens, right? And so you can see how this could drive businesses out, or more specifically, make it less attractive for anyone, kind of to create homegrown businesses, right? And Ross and I actually had the opportunity right before, maybe even just during COVID, we did a Zoom kind of seminar with the city council to talk a lot about their tax structure and why it was really hurting the city of Philadelphia. Now, the question is, I don't know if they ever made any movement. Maybe that's why they made their way up. I don't know exactly.
Well, I don't know either. I've wondered because they did move up.
Yeah, but there's an interesting point here too about we also are measuring the city as a unit, sort of within the city limits. But a lot of the economic activity, and sometimes even the bad regulations, are outside the city limits, right? So think about a place like Phoenix. A lot of people don't live in Phoenix per se. A lot of people commute into Phoenix and they'll live in Scottsdale, or they'll live in Tempe or Mesa or Chandler. So that's another reason why it's important to have cities that are kind of in what they call the metropolitan area, right? Because in a sense, those, what they call MSAs, metropolitan statistical areas, what the Census Bureau calls them, having those all grouped together is actually a much fuller picture. And so that's something I know Ross and I talked a lot about early on.
And we're continuing the process
Yeah.
That Steve started of these clusters, and we've expanded the number of cities in the Phoenix area, but we've also done the same thing in some other places as well to try to get multiple cities like Raleigh, North Carolina, have Raleigh, Durham,
right,
and have in Texas, right, Fort Worth, Dallas, etc. So you get and so over time, as this index grows, we'll have not only the bragging rights between Philadelphia, New York City, and Washington, D.C., but between, cities around New York, cities around Washington, because Arlington, Virginia, for example, was number one in one of the years, as it was ranked number one in one of the years. And then here, of course, we're trying to always make sure we continue to grow the Arizona representation in the report. So we'll add more there and also in the Tucson area. And then, you can always add to California or New York. But we're trying to build those kind of clusters. So partly because it's interesting for not only for research interest, but for cities that are looking for advantages, perhaps in attracting businesses, to recognize that if I'm going to come to the Phoenix area, I may actually want to come to this place rather than this other place because there's a better advantage for us there.
Great point.
From a public policy standpoint in your research, have you seen a breaking point where cities change course from a public policy standpoint? Have you seen any data with regard to that? And I'm thinking, I'm looking at cities here that used to be growth. I mean, we go back to California, but one city in particular is San Diego, which was on a great growth trajectory.
Right.
Doing great things, revitalized downtown.
Yeah.
When I remember when I was living in Tucson, I mean, we used to go to San Diego to see what they did, in terms of their economic vitality, and now they're ranked so low on this list. What is there a breaking point for a city to change course?
Well, you can ask the people in Detroit. I mean, there was a breaking point there, right? And I mean, you would know better than I. But here's an example. Like this is what they call like a black swan event. It's just the whole system broke, and they had to kind of rebuild. And it does seem like it's gotten revitalized.
Yeah. Well, they also had
great
major entrepreneurs who invested and took the advantage of investing in the parts of Detroit that were sort of the worst off areas, right downtown in the middle. Dan Gilbert, an entrepreneur who had his original company was Rock Financial, and today it's Rocket Mortgage, which actually did what many cities need to do, which is he created the process. He created for buying a home. Instead of you're going to your lawyer's office and then maybe also if you're in some states going to a title office and going to another office, and making all these stops, his company put together the whole package and delivers the entire document to you at your house, and you make 5 signatures, and it stands for buying a home. And so someone like that moving into a blighted area that then brought his employees with him and gave his employees discounts for buying homes in the area and upgrading homes. One of my former students worked as an executive in Rock Financial, or what became the new company, and so they brought a workforce with them, which then revitalized the downtown core. But we've seen it go the other way too, right? With policies put in place that are driving people out of areas, but sometimes cities don't mind that happening. So
yeah, going back to Portland or whatever, sometimes that's on purpose, which I find astounding. So this is probably a good time for us. This is first on our podcast. We're going to open this up for questions.
Q&A.
Audience questions. We haven't done that in our podcast.
Well, I was going to just interject on one point about Detroit is that the turnaround has been so dramatic. Even the Lions are winning.
Yes, this is
for the first time ever.
Inexplicable. Yes.
The entire
so
time
it's been rather historical.
Yeah.
All right. So anyone have a question?
I'm wondering.
Let's give you a microphone.
Oh, sorry. I can see Chandler on here, and that a lot of money's gone to the east side of the valley. And I'm wondering at Glendale, Peoria, Scottsdale, are they so low on the list, or they were not even checked?
Oh, I don't think they're on the list, right? I don't think they're even.
They're not on the list.
They're
I'm
not.
wondering,
Yeah. So there's actually.
They
So it's one of those
bad
things.
They didn't make the list, or you didn't
No.
add them.
We choose the list.
Okay, so you didn't choose any of the West Side Valley cities.
That's correct. So let me just give you an idea of how it was.
Population. It's a population.
Correct. So it's a population threshold, and sometimes the cities didn't make the population threshold.
That's right.
Also, we tried to avoid, and this is what we might call the California problem. We're also trying to avoid having too many cities per state. And so we capped it, I think the first couple editions, we capped it at 4 to 6. It was capped at 5. Okay. Capped it at 5. So I think over time, and that's also a manpower issue, right? We're dealing with 60 some odd cities through this, and trying to make sure that we're doing our due diligence on all of the cities that we do have on the list. But I think over time, you'll probably get places like that where we can lower the population threshold and start including them, especially as we talk about the metropolitan area. West side of the valley is an important part of the metro area, right? So we want to be able to capture that over time. What's also interesting too, though, and maybe this matters, this is the methodological question. The threshold is here, let's say, and let's say you had a place like San Francisco that used to be here, and then they're losing a population, they drop down. It's like, are they suddenly irrelevant? I don't know. That's a good question, right? So I think so one of the things we decided to do, at least the last edition anyway, I think, or 2 editions ago, is we wanted to find where population was going. And so we started to add them to the list too. And so it's a balance, but that really is just because of kind of the rules we set up to kind of create what we knew was a finite product that we had to kind of get out the door in a year, basically. Sure.
Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and take this next. Great talk so far. I think this is a really important and cool data set that really highlights some of the very drastic differences in between different cities. But it also represents a good chance for people like me who are researchers to actually interact with public policymakers, which doesn't happen very often and probably should happen more often, because there's lots of ways that we can have this conversation, bringing together sort of the academics and the rest of the world. How would you suggest we go about that? Or do you have any recommendations for how this particular data set could be really important to making city policy?
You want to start?
No.
No? Okay. All right. So first of all, exposure is important. So people need to know more about it. So please talk to your friends and neighbors and everything you know. But I do think as this goes forward, so we're in our fourth or fifth edition. I'm trying to remember now. Fourth edition. So, and one of my dreams for this data set, not just as a researcher, but also as someone who helped Ross bring it into existence, is I'd like the idea of having a long enough time frame where we can start to see patterns over time. Right now, we kind of what they call a cross section. We have different cities and we just see them in a snapshot in time and compare them in that snapshot. But over time, you're going to have several snapshots and they're all going to look different over the years, especially in those cases where you have those inflection points where cities either break or they change course before they break, and you'll see what those kind of outcomes would look like. But again, so exposure is part of it. Long-term data and time series, kind of better, larger number of dates. But I think at the end of the day, it really does come down to policymakers willing to make the decisions that are going to make their cities better. And political courage is not something we have much control over, unfortunately. It's not for lack of answers. I mean, we know the right way to create prosperity in a state or a city, right? And in fact, in a very large part, the reason we chose the metrics that we did kind of within the subcategories was we realized that there's a lot of things that the United States does well that a lot of countries don't do. And so we didn't really measure that because we're all on the same page on that one in the United States. But there's other things, tax policy, minimum wage, zoning, like these things are actually pretty critical to city by city comparisons. And those rankings can give policymakers the opportunity to be prideful about where they live or be ashamed. Now, how ashamed a politician would get about something, I don't know. And maybe shame seems to also be a scarce commodity among politicians. But I would say that having that out there is an important part of it. And this is something that I think most people hadn't really illustrated up to now, because again, a lot of the analysis was done at the state level, not so much at the city level.
Right. I might add that a different connection here is I recently learned through another research project that the center has done that the behavioral insights team in Great Britain, which is called the Nudge Unit. Mm-hmm. This is the kind of the organization that was encouraging you to wash your hands, singing,
row, row, row your boat, I think it was.
Yeah, whichever song you want to choose. Happy birthday, row your boat, things like that. But they actually have a relationship with the city of Mesa. And they're advising the city of Mesa on streamlining regulations and streamlining other city infrastructure to make a more efficient city. And so you have behavioral research team and policymakers, and we're doing some of the same things, like trying to encourage policymakers to take academic research seriously in terms of the kinds of opportunities that might be available for something to happen.
Yeah.
And we had a very interesting dialogue with the behavioral insight guy.
I'm sure
It was a lot of fun. He was doing a lot of stuff that, that would fit into some of the, you might see the impact of some of it in the categories down in the future for the city of Mesa.
Great.
One data set that that is not included in the back end of this report, but it definitely is going to be plaguing policymakers, and has been the last several years, is crime. Mm-hmm. And, when you look at this list, that's why Philadelphia, I think, is so stark, because we know that that crime is pretty acute in Philadelphia. We know that crime is still pretty acute in Detroit. So on a go-ahead basis, how much is that?
That's a good question.
How much is that part of your research?
Yeah. No, I think there is some research on this. I've actually done a little bit of it.
Defund the police to now we need to refund the police.
Well, there's also, it's a supply and demand question in a lot of ways, right? So in some senses, these are economic questions, in the sense that, I'll give you a good example. And this is actually not specifically in the report, but it's an example of a state level regulation that actually can impact the crime rate in a state. You've heard about occupational licensing, right? And a lot of occupational licensing laws have within them something called a good moral character provision. That means that if you come out of prison, you have a prison record, even if you've been trained for a job inside the prison, you still can't get a license because you have a criminal record, right? Texas does this with barbers. They had a barber school within the walls of the prison. They would come out, they couldn't get a barber's license. Firefighters in California, wildfire fires, they would bring them out to fight wildfires in Northern California. And then when they came out of prison, they couldn't actually be a firefighter because they had a prison record, right? So first of all, this is a weird waste of resources. Right. You're spending money to train people, and then they can't get jobs on the outside. But what I was curious to know, and I looked at these licensing laws and found that, okay, states that had the most stringent laws that kept people from coming out of prison and getting gainful employment, basically giving them skin in the game, something to lose, something to help them get back on their feet and get a second chance. Those states that restricted that ability had higher reoffense rates than the states that didn't, right? So this is an important policy change you can make. They call it the recidivism rate. Right. And so the states that were able to embark upon better employment opportunities just by stepping out of the way and letting people who had already done their time and were clean and staying on the level, as they say, could still get gainful employment. That was one of the best things they could have done. And it didn't come down to increasing police money, although that may have been an important part of it too overall. And it's not monocausal, but an important part of this is having the supply of jobs available. And again, that all comes back to being able to create the environment for prosperity.
Well, and despite my best efforts to continue the population growth, I have our 8th child on the way. The job, we're going to have an employment crisis, right? In the sense that we're not producing enough people to keep up with what the job expectations are going to be over time. And if we have restrictive immigration issues, these are all things that figuring out ways to bridge that gap is going to be really important. So I think that's a very good point.
Yeah, you have the aging of the workforce. So a lot of people are coming out of the workforce, retiring. So it is going to be a real problem. And again, I think this is going to be a big thing for policymakers. And I think maybe they're just not noticing. Pension problems are also a big looming one as well. And that's all related too, right? Especially when it comes to immigration and the aging of the population. And so I think, again, policy is extremely important in all of these things. Everything you've just mentioned are impacted by government policy, regulation, or some kind of restriction. And so liberalizing those, loosening those up, that's how you actually create more, great use of resources.
Any other questions?
Well, back here in the back.
So I'd like to turn the question of, would you move your business, to Arizona what does it take, since I noticed there isn't a big percentage difference between some of these cities we disparage and say Salt Lake City in terms of your point system here, 84 versus 74 or whatever, when does a business say this is the last straw? this is, you know, the last tax increase or the last reg or whatever. Have you ever thought of the question, not to, but when am I leaving from? Because you mentioned California is just limping along and so on, but when do you make that call that you're going?
You want to answer that? Well, I think it's going to vary, certainly going to vary by business. And I think it'll vary by industry as well. There's a certain reality that some companies can just take the hit on taxes, for instance, right? Or just the regulatory hit, which is why I think California has limped along enough as it has for the time that it has. But that's not most businesses, right? So most businesses are smaller businesses, small and medium-sized businesses employ. I think it's close to 75 or 80% of the overall workforce in most states, right? So that's what they would call, you know, sort of the volatile portion of it. And sometimes people don't move businesses because that's where they grew up. They just don't want to go anywhere, right? And so they're willing to take that hit. And so sometimes it comes down to what their tolerance is, and that doesn't necessarily have to always be economic. What I would say, though, and bring it back to the mobility issue, workers are more mobile than companies, right? And so if workers are moving out of your state or your city, and you're having a harder time to get employment, then maybe you might consider something like, well, maybe I need to be considering moving my business, or maybe getting into a different business that has a better potential in an area. So I think it does come down to the workers are sort of the leading indicator in a lot of this. And so I think it's going to depend upon where people are most likely to want to move in a lot of ways.
I have a follow-up question to that question. Have you done any correlational analysis between outbound and inbound migration based on the ease of doing business, and also on starting a business? Probably more than moving your business, starting a business may differ depending on the ease of it.
We haven't done that yet.
Well, on the business starts, we did do a piece early on with like the first or second edition. We correlated the score, and it did correlate between the business starts and the DBNA rank of at least, I think it was version 2 or something, right? We've done that. And some specific categories have also yielded some interesting insights. And so a good example would be business start density, meaning the number of businesses that started per square mile in a city was actually strongly related to the zoning restrictions in a city, right? So again, fairly not surprising, right? About what you would expect, somewhat intuitive. But then again, that's what we're hoping to have more scholars like Alicia and people who as they become exposed to this data set, can start finding questions we never even thought to ask. And so the preliminary our preliminary analysis seems to indicate that we're on the right track, that economic liberty does create a rising tide to lift all boats.
Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.